back. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another Glacial Geek Deep Thoughts Thin Coats with me, Phil, the Glacial Geek. So, I'm here. I'm in Savannah. I have arrived. This is going to be the future home of the Glacial Geek in here. This is going to be my office studio setup. So, I've got some plans, or it's coming, but we got a desk, we got a chair, so that's the first step, and that should be the primary step. Now I just gotta wait for my stuff to get here, all of my stuff to get here. My models made it here in one piece, but everything else is still in transit. So no thin coats today, only deep thoughts. But yeah, so far I got here, I went over to local store, Savannah Line Games, and met a couple guys there, which was a lot of fun. They seemed really nice. I'm really excited about getting to work with them here. So it should be a good time. So everything should be going well. Everything seems to be on track to go well, and we'll just keep going. I've got plenty of bat reps lined up, so I can keep going with what I have for a while now, so we shouldn't have a problem with that. So, on to the topic for today, which is going to be upping your painting game. A lot of what I'm gonna say is gonna be relatively basic stuff that I think most painters, once you get past a certain level, already know. But you may not, and I just think it's basic stuff that a lot of times when people show their work and they're like, oh, my painting is awful, I hate my painting, I hate the way my models look. Oftentimes it's because of minor things that they can do that aren't hard, that are very easy techniques, but that you learn to do as you go along. So learning those basic techniques are really going to come a long way in helping out with your painting, and I think it's really going to up your game so that you can feel proud of what you do, because it takes a lot of work, takes a lot of time, and you get better as you go on, as you develop skills, as you develop techniques, as you just develop an eye for what you're doing. It becomes easier and better as you go along, but there are some basic techniques that you can utilize that really can up your game right off the bat if you're just starting off, especially. So the first thing you need to do is remember not to judge your models until they're done. I know it seems pretty simple, but you know, all of the finished models that you see didn't start out looking that way. They oftentimes, when you first put down that first base coat, when you first block in the colors, look awful. They look flat, they look plastic, they look like crap. Literally every model I paint, I get to a point when I'm painting, I'm like, this looks like crap. I hate this. This is coming out awful. This is not doing what I want it to do. And usually once I hit a certain point, I go, okay, never mind. I can see where this is going. This is going to look better. But keeping yourself from judging it from that point is going to keep you from quitting painting. It's going to keep you from giving up on what you're doing. Nobody likes how their models look midway through the painting process, because you always get to this point when you paint it, it looks awful, it looks flat, it looks annoying, and you just want to throw it away. And if you do throw it away, it'll never get any better. But if you stick to it through the process, through all the different processes that it takes, it's gonna look better, and you're gonna be happier with it, and you can get better. You know, I look at some of my earlier models, and they're not great. You know what I mean? Or they're not. I don't know. The ones I use, some of them, they annoy me. They look like I don't have the patience to go back and strip them and start over again. But you know, my newer painting jobs are usually much better than the last ones. So you will get better, but not stopping yourself partway through the process is going to make things a lot easier and a lot better. So that's the first step. The second step is know the different levels that you have to do to paint, because a lot of people think you just take plastic, you put some paint on it, and it looks good. There's a lot that goes into making it look good from plastic to fully painted. And I'm not even talking about, I'm not a commission painter, I'm not a heavy metal guy. I basically get my models to what I consider decent tabletop standard. And a decent tabletop standard makes people happy. They like to see a decent tabletop standard. They like to oogle at the really fine, display pieces that you see for like Golden Demon or Crystal Brush. But if you get an army that's painted to a decent tabletop standard, people will be impressed and they'll like it. And it's not hard. It doesn't take a lot of skill to do what I do. what it takes is understanding the different methods. So the first thing you need to do is prime your models. Priming your models allows the model itself, it creates a surface that's going to allow the paint to adhere to it better. So it's going to keep it from chipping as much, it's going to keep it from wearing off. It does a lot better of adhering that paint that you're going to be putting on later onto the model, so that you don't have to touch up this work that you've done, that you've put into this, a lot of work that you put into it. You don't have to go back and touch it up all the time. So if you prime the models first, it primes the surface to adhere to the paint, allow the paint to adhere to it better. So that's the first step, is priming your models. You can use anything. You can use black primer, white primer, gray primer, a colored primer. Oftentimes it's real nice to have a colored primer because it makes your first base coat a lot easier. So if you're going to do Blood Angels, for instance, if you use like a red primer, you're probably going to have 1 or 2 coats of base coat to get what you want done without any streaks or thin parts. If you use a red primer, it just cuts down on the work that you have to do in later steps if you use a colored primer. And it works best usually on armies that have a single color to them. So a lot of the Space Marine armies, if you're doing the quarters, you're like the Howling Griffins, you're going to be a bit more of a situation there, because putting yellow over red or red over yellow isn't necessarily the easiest. So you might be better off sticking to one of the standard gray, white, or black. And understand what those different choices are going to do. Black primer is going to give you a darker look. I mean, it's pretty simple. It sounds pretty simple, but it is that simple. That a black primer is going to give you a darker look to your paints. Gray primer is going to give you a nice middle of the road. I like to go with gray primer. It allows me to control what I want my paints to look like on my own without too much of an interference from the base. And you can use white if you want a really bright look to your models. So understand that that's what's going to happen. So if you're looking for a dark and dungy look to your army, like you're looking for, let's say Raven Guard or something like that, and you want it to be dark and you want it to be intense, then going with a white primer is going to be counterintuitive. It's going to add a lot more work to what you're trying to do, and it's not going to be helpful to you. So pick your primer and make sure you know what you're doing with it. You know what I mean? So if you want a bright, if you're looking for white scars, white primer is probably going to be best for you. If you're going for, like I said, Raven Wing, Raven Guard, Raven Wing, whatever, Raven anything, go with a black primer. Death Watch, go with a black primer. Black Templars, black primer. What it does is it creates a situation where you save yourself work going forward. And the next step forward is then the base coat. The base coat is basically the first one that you're going to put down is going to be whatever is primarily on your model. So if you're running, like I said, Blood Angels, red is going to be your first base coat. If you use a red primer, it's only going to take a coat or 2 to get it down. If you're using a different color primer, it might take some more to make sure you have a smooth surface. But it's important to make sure that you have an even coat of the red or whatever color you're doing your base to start out with, because that base is going to be what shows through everything else. Because you can mess up on some of the details, you can miss different parts, but as long as you've got your base coat down, it's not going to become evident to people looking at the model. But if they can see, primer underneath it, you're going to have more trouble. If you have streaks on it, people are going to notice that. So get a good base coat of whatever the majority of your model color is. You know what I mean? Some of them are more difficult, like if you're doing Imperial Guard and they've got a couple different colors on them, it might take a couple different colors of base coat, but that first primary, just straight up color, whatever it is. So if you're going, like I said, if you're going with Cadians, you've got like the drab color on most of their armor. You could do a face, like a flesh tone for their face as a base coat. You can put brown onto their boots if you want to go with it. But the first color has to be pretty smooth, and it's going to be the underpinning for everything else. So they talk about thinning your paints. This is where it's most important to have thin paints, because you want this to get into all the crevices. You want this to get into the different places without filling in those details. So thin paints is important here. So either thin it down with water or thin it down with a what's it called? Like a medium of sort, like a Lamian medium. Some people use, it just thins it down a little bit so that you've got airbrush thinner is usually a good one to do. I like to use airbrush thinner when I thin my paints. What it does is it makes a thinner coat. It takes more coats to cover, but you have more control over it as you're putting it down. Sometimes this may be heresy to a lot of people, especially considering it, but I oftentimes, when I do my base coats, I often do it straight out of the pot, which is a very thick paint. But what it does require is it requires you to work it in. So make sure that you're brushing through, make sure you're not leaving like globs of paint on any one place, and just thin it out yourself as you go over it. You know what I mean? So that as you're pulling it down the model, this works, it's more effective on something with a flatter surface. So sort of like a Space Marine armor is easier to work with this kind of stuff, or a Tau battlesuit or something like that. Because what you're doing is you're just dragging the paint and you're thinning it physically by dragging it across and making sure that you don't leave globs. Because if you start globbing it on to try to create a flat surface, like if you're just trying to make sure you don't leave anything behind, you're going to glob the paint and you're going to get a really bad look, and you're not going to be happy with what you have. Because there's a lot of detail, especially on these GW models, and a lot of other models anyway, there's a lot of detail that you don't want to lose. And it's going to be important to have that detail in the next step. So if you glob it up, you're going to hurt yourself going forward. So if you're working on it, make sure, if you're using it straight out of the pot, just make sure you physically thin the coat that you're doing, and don't push it. So like I said, don't expect even one coat of this to cover everything. It still takes me 2 or 3 coats to make sure I get it all down. I just don't want to waste the time and paint put it onto a palette. So I just physically keep it down, and then I let it dry and go over with another coat. Usually it takes me about 2 coats at that point, because it keeps it relative. I can control it easier as I've been doing it. But make sure that you're not blocking in details. Make sure you're not filling in details. Actually a little bit of an addendum to that, filling in details. When you're doing your primer, don't do a thick coat of primer, because this is not meant to be your base coat. This is not meant to give color to it. It's just meant to prime the surface. So if you go with a light primer, what it does is it primes the surface without filling in the details. And if there are spaces in between little nooks and crannies that aren't covered by the primer, it's fine. It's not, those areas aren't going to get dinged and banged, and they're not going to be handled as much. The more important parts to get down a good prime is on the areas that you're going to be touching. So the main parts of the body, where you're going to be picking up the models to move them around during the movement phase, or you're picking them up and putting them into your cases, or when they get banged around as they're pushed off to the side as they're killed or whatever. But always be careful not to block in your details with paint, either in the priming session or in the base coating session. So usually at this point, people especially beginning painters, they stop at this base coat area, because they put color onto this and they think that that's it, that's all they've done. They already painted over the entire model. The model has paint on it, and they consider themselves done. So you see that in a lot of, like, have you ever seen the ones where they've got the globby faces, like the sergeants, where they're like, and they're all like just a glob of paint? They look like, I like to call mine, from back when I was a tween, when I was painting, the melting cow guys. I think I've shown them before. If not, when I get them out of packing, when I come back and packing, I'll show you guys. But it's basically, I just globbed on the paint so that it would actually not show through, and I just called it a day, and it looks awful. It looks really bad. And a lot of people stop here because they think, oh, I've painted the model. The model's painted. It's got all the paint on it. But this is what you're doing with these base coat, is you're creating the foundation from which you're working later. People think primer is, but primer just makes the model paintable. The base coat is the basis for the rest of everything that you're going to work on. So at this point, once you've base coated your model, I, at this point, like to wash the models, and not like hand soap, wash the models. I like to use a wash. So GW has a really great line of washes. So they've got Null and Oil for a black wash, Agrex Earthshade for a brown wash, Seraphim Sepia, which is like more of a yellowy kind of brown wash. Usually it looks good on parchments, that kind of thing. They've got Druchii Violet, which is a purple wash. They've got Drakenhof Nightshade, which is a blue wash. I think they've got Camo Shade. I think they've got like a green wash. They've got a whole line of different washes which work. And what washes are meant to do is they're meant to be super thin and get into all the nooks and crannies to provide dimension. They provide the shadowing of all of the different details. So if you leave it at the base coat, yeah, it's gonna look super flat because it's all the same color. There's no dimension to it. looks super flat. That's the point when I paint, when I'm like, oh, I hate this. This looks awful. Because sometimes it takes a bit to make sure your colors that you're blocking in are work, because this is also where I go back and I touch up mistakes. Like if I get the red from my bolter casing onto the chest, I'll go back and touch up with the green for my Dark Angels. That's what I was talking about. And I'll make sure that once I've got a good base coat of all the different colors, nice and neat and cleaned up any mistakes that I've made, that's when I do the washes. And I like to wash the whole model. I like to put a wash on every part of it. A lot of people don't like to get washes onto the flat portions or up portions. That's a more detailed, that's a more technical use of the washes. Honestly, because I mean, Army Painter has something called, they call it a dip wash or a quick shade, which is basically you just dip it into the shade, you know, shake it off a bit, put it down there so it all drains off to the floor, and then or down to the base, and you just kind of sop it up as it drips off of it, and it just gives a nice dimension to the model. And it's a quick use. You can do that with the GW shades, and you don't have to worry, because I think the quick shade is like a oil-based one, which is a little bit, it's something else that you would have to do. But if you just want to use the paint brush and you just want to go into the pot, I love using the GW shades, and I just put it over the whole thing. So for my Dark Angels, I put the base coat of Caliban, and then and the red on the bolter, and the metal for the gunmetal, and then I just go over the whole thing with Nuln Oil. And with the Nuln Oil, what this does is it just gets into all the crevices, so along the edges of the pauldrons, into all the chest parts. A lot of the models now, like on the arms, they've got the little nooks and crannies, the little gadgets and whatnot. Just gets into all of that, and it darkens it down a bit, which I like a darker look, which is, we'll get into the next step. But at this point with the shades, if you wanted to give it at the shade, it's going to look good. It's got dimension. Now the model has dimension. If you did a good enough job of being neat with your base coats and fixing any problems, it's going to look good. You've got dimension, you've got color. You're going to be happy with them on the tabletop. You know, they're not going to win you a golden demon, but they will look good on the tabletop. And it's not that hard at that point, because you put on a base coat and you put on a wash. Most of the times you're good to go. I like to go another step beyond this with mine, which is putting in details. So at this point, I like to have a brighter eye, so I put in my eyes after I've done the washes to make sure that it doesn't get blocked in with the wash. Because you also, when you're putting in the wash, you need to be careful that it doesn't like fill in too many of the details. You want them to get into all the details, and you want them to be into the different parts, but you don't want it to just pool up. And also make sure it doesn't pool up on any of the flat surfaces. So if you put it on the shoulder, you want to get it on the edges, make sure you, with your brush, that you're wiping it down when you put it on so that it doesn't just pool on there, because it can give like a wet spot. And a lot of people don't like to do it on the whole model because of that. But I've noticed that as long as I've been careful, and especially with figures versus vehicles, I have an easier time with that. With the vehicles, you need to be more careful with how you put it on, because you've got a lot wider swath that you're putting down this wash onto, and you just got to make sure it doesn't just pool up in areas, especially on like flat surfaces, because then it can get a little bit bad. But as long as you're careful and you're just observant of what you're doing and think about what you're doing, you can usually control it as long as you put it over. And it saves a lot of time, as opposed to having going in on every single edge and every little detail with it, because that drives me nuts. And I can't do that. That's not in my nature to be able to do. I have a friend who does the glowing runes on his Grey Knights, and it looks fantastic, but it takes him like 8 different layers of each rune that he's doing, and I'm like, oh man, I would have broken the model in half by the time I got to that. So for knowing me and knowing how I work, just putting the wash down like that and just being careful about how it's going on gives me a look that I like. So once you've got the wash on, make sure at each of these different steps that you wait for things to dry. It's very important that you wait for them to dry, because if you start trying to paint on a wet surface, it's going to smudge and it's going to mix and it's not going to look good. So if you wait for it to dry, you can go to the next step, and you don't have to wait like days for them to dry. You know, just wait. Honestly, if I'm painting a squad of 10 guys, by the time I've finished putting on a color to the last guy, I can go back and start putting on color on the next guy, put another coat down on the first guy. He's usually dry enough for me to work with at that point. As long as you're doing thin coats. If you glob it on, it's going to take a lot longer to dry, and it's not going to look as good. So as long as you're using thin coats, either mechanically thin by making sure you're painting it on thin, or thinned down with medium or water or something like that, you should be good to go. So yeah, so now you've got your wash on, your shade. It's now going to look, it's going to have dimension, it's going to look good. At this point usually this is the point where I have to turn around when I'm painting the models. I look and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, this looks good. I like this. I like what's happening here. The next step I do is I like to do details at this point. Like I said, I like to put in the eyes. I like to put on the little, buttons that they have on there to mark lights, just to give a little bit of a detail, a little bit of a highlight to whatever's going on. But just like a little pop that happens on these. So you'll see on a lot of my models, sometimes like when I have they got the wrist things on some of the Primaris Marines now, I like to paint that stuff in afterwards so it has a brighter color, so it hasn't been darkened down by the washes that I use. It just pops. I like that. So that's what I do. And honestly, at this point, I call it done. I do the basing as well, which I can go into in a bit. I will go into in a bit, but I call them done because I like a darker look. I like the darker aesthetic. It looks good to me. It has dimension because of the washes. You're usually good. You're good to go. It's going to look good on the tabletop. And if you're not looking to win painting prizes, if you're not just looking to have a painted army that looks good on the table, honestly, you're good to go at this point. I know that sounds like heresy, and people are like, what about highlight? I'll get into highlight in a second because it can up the look on a lot of your models, but honestly, if you're just trying to paint a whole army, you just want a painted army to look good on the table, you're good at this point. You really are. Put a few details, put in the eyes at this point. That's not easy. And that might take some work to work on. But basically you need really thin paint for that, because if it globs on, it's gonna get in there and it's not gonna look good. So that I do thin down my paints when I do the eyes. And what I do is I put in the whites, and then I just go and I do a little line so that it touches the black from the top to bottom. Because if you don't, you get like my crazy looking scout with the beady eyes. So you want to have it so that there's no white on the top or bottom. They look better that way. And sometimes you mess up, and then you just go back, put down wipe out as much as you can while it's wet. And then just go back and touch up the area around there. You can even go back and shade if you need to, and then start over again. But just be careful and just be gentle and practice, and the eyes eventually can come. It's the hardest part. It's still, to this day, is the hardest part for me when I'm painting my models. So yeah, so then I've got that point. At that point, you can be done. At that point, you're gonna have an army that looks good on the tabletop. People are gonna be like, oh yeah, okay, that looks good. It's a painted army. At that point, it looks painted. And that's I think the key thing is to understand that a painted army isn't just an army with paint on it. It's an army that looks painted. And to look painted, you need those different steps. You need to have the base coat, you need to have the washes, you need to put in some details. And if you put in the time to make it look like that, it's going to look good. People are going to be impressed. They may not be hiring you to paint their army for them, but they will be. They'll appreciate it. It'll look good on the table. It'll look much better than the hordes of gray plastic. And that doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't take a lot of skill. It just takes It does take some time, and it does take some practice. But honestly, the techniques that I use now, I could have used in the beginning when I first started out, and I would have been it's not hard techniques to use. So now the next step that you can do is you can highlight a model. I oftentimes like to highlight my vehicles, because I find with vehicles, it needs a little bit more to give it a little bit of a oomph, a little bit of a pop. So there's two basic options when it comes to highlighting. There's dry brushing and there's edge highlighting. Those are the two basic ones. You can go into other ones where you can blend it in, you can have different colors going down. That's fine. If you want to go into that, that's like a much harder skill to develop, and you can work on it and you can do it over time. It's just going to take a bit. But if you're still just starting off, or you just want the basics of an army, the two basic methods for highlighting are dry brushing and edge highlighting. Dry brushing is you take, they have dry brush paints. What they are is they're high pigment value with less water in there, and it's designed designed to make it easier to do what you're going to do. Because what you need is to get a brush that you're not too super fond of, because you're going to be abusing the crap out of it during this process. So an older brush, preferably a bit larger, that has stiffer bristles. And what you can do with them is you take it, you put some paint on it, and then you take a piece of paper. It seems ironic that I'm doing this without my paints here. But you take a paper towel and then you blot it out until there's very little paint still left on it. And rub it into the bristles, rub it in there so that it gets in all the bristles, but then keep rubbing it on the paper towel until there's very little left on the brush. And then what you want to do is you want to go over it and just brush it onto there, concentrating on edges. So any, you know, on like the Space Marine helmet, you know, they've got the little ridge on the top that kind of goes down. You can concentrate on there, onto the face plate, onto the arms and the shoulder, the edges of the pauldron, onto the kneecaps, things like that, edges of the shoes, guns. Guns, yeah, you just want to choose a color that complements. It's a brighter color. I think GW is coming out with an app that lets you know the different colors that lead up well from each other, from your base to your highlight, which is beautiful, which is fantastic because it takes out a lot of guessing. Because I've had a couple times when I've been doing it and I do an edge highlight, I'm like, that is ridiculously too bright for what I'm trying to do, or too dark and it just doesn't come out and it doesn't show anything, which is equally as frustrating because you just went through the time of doing it. So you just dry brush on it, concentrating in it, and what it does is it leaves down a very small amount of the color. And you want to control it so that it looks like on top, so you're not dry brushing underneath because there's no light coming on there. You want to have it up on the top of the different surfaces more so than the bottoms, and just go over along where there's texture, where there's little bits and nooks and crannies, like edges that are sticking out on the backpacks of Space Marines, things like that. And you just go over it and you control it. Do it if you've got a very little paint on there, you can go over there and you just slowly build it up as you're going on. And what this does is it blends in a highlight onto the model, and it looks good. It looks really good. I like the way dry brushing looks. It's a bit messier, so a lot of the pros don't like to use it as much because it is a little bit more of a rough look to it. But if you're just beginner or you're not looking to have golden demon quality, you just want to have a nice looking tabletop painted army, then it looks really good. It does a really good job. So just go over there and control it, but it's key to make sure you don't have too much paint on there. Otherwise you're just going to end up just slapping a different color paint onto it, and you might have to go back and fix up the problem that you make. So just make sure that there's very little paint left on the brush, but you do want to have enough that you can work into all the bristles, so all of it does have it. But then, like I said, rub it off on the brush. And like I said, you're going to be beating up these brushes. You're just like rubbing it in to the paper towel to get it off of there. And then just go over there and control it as it goes on to the edges, and you'll have a nice highlight. It looks good. And at that point, you're pretty much done. You're done with it. And then the other method of highlighting is edge highlighting, which is you take a brush, a very thin brush, like a detail brush, and you take the highlight color. You don't want to use the dry brush paints for this because there's not enough medium involved in them. But you just go, they've got different methods, the layer paint or something like a brighter layer paint. Like I said, I think the app that's coming out is going to help you figure out what you need. But you just need a brighter color of what you're doing without being too much of a jump. Like if you're doing, what was it? Oh, like if you're doing Caliban green, you can't use moot green to do, or no, maybe it's moot green. I can't tell. I don't have my paints on me right now. But there's like a bright green that I use for my cabling. And I one time tried to use that as an edge highlight, and I was like, nope, too bright. So I just, now it's used for cables. So I think it looks cool with that, and it makes a nice contrast. But it's too much for edge highlights at that point. So yeah, so you go over the edge with it, and what you do is you take the brush and you just pick out all of the sharpest edges. So the edge of the pauldrons, like I said, that crest on the Space Marine helmet, the front of their mask, the backpack around the bubble things up on here, around the edges of that. Down around the arms, any parts where the armor, seams of the armor going along the edges there, and you just pick them out. And what you can do is if it's a really sharp edge, you can actually use the side of the brush and just hold it at an angle and just go along the side there. And what it does is it just picks out all of those edges and it gives an edge highlight. I like this a lot for vehicles. I use it all the time on all my vehicles. because it gives a nice look, especially on the bigger models like that, you know, and you can control it so you can have it more towards the points. You have it brighter coming towards the points where edges meet at like points. And you just kind of, you develop the skill as you go further, but the basic one is just put a really thin line of a brighter color along all the edges. And it takes a bit of time. This does take a lot of time, which is why if you're just trying to get a painted army and you've just got a bunch of dude bros, you know, you don't necessarily have to highlight. I don't think so. I don't highlight a lot of my models, and they look darker. They look cool. I like them. I think they work good for what I'm looking for. I'm not trying to win a painting contest. I'm just trying to make them look decent on a tabletop, so that when you guys are watching my battle reports, you're not just looking at base ugly plastic. I can just make them look good. But it does take a lot of time, but they do look good. When you see a model that's properly highlighted, it looks good. Another method that you could use for highlight actually harkens back to the priming. They call it pre-shading, which is where you do black primer underneath. You know, you do a black primer, and then on top, you just take a white primer and you just go and just do a nice, really quick from the top and only from the top, looking down onto put a nice thin layer of that. And what it creates is it creates like a, just a natural base underneath everything of a natural highlight. And this is a super easy way to do it. You just have the pre-shading, because then when you put down your base coat, like I talked about the interactions, that it's gonna look brighter on white than it is on black. Well, now suddenly you have white and black, so it's gonna have brighter on top and darker underneath, and you have an instant highlight shade. So if you're doing it quick and you wanna have a shade, you wanna have that kind of highlight, that would be what I would suggest, is an undershade. A pre-shade, and what it'll do is it'll allow you to just develop it. It looks a little bit nicer. I don't do it. I just do gray primer, but it works. But yeah, so then once you have the shading, once you have the highlight, you're done. So that's honestly, that's the key to upping your painting game, is just understanding that there are actually multiple steps to painting a model than just putting paint on a model. Because putting paint on a model is going to be flat. It's not going to look good if you don't make sure it's neat, if you don't make sure that you've got details worked out, if you don't make sure that you've properly thinned your paint so that you're not globbing up details, if you haven't made sure that you have dimension to the model, it's not going to look good and you're going to be disappointed. And I understandably so, because you did put effort into it. You did take the time to paint it, so you want it to look good. If you're just understanding that painting a painted model isn't just a model with paint on it, it's a model that went through the process of getting different types of paint and different methods of painting on them to create a finished painted look. At that point, you've got to paint a model. At that point, you've got a model that's going to look good on the tabletop you're going to be happy with. There's basing. Basing's a good one. The base one that I started out with was just painting my base. You know, just going over with a brown and just painting the base, and you've got the model, you've got the base painted at that point. It's got a uniform color throughout the army. That's the base one. At that point, it looks fine. You got a painted base. The next step I would take is using the basing paints that GW has. They are fantastic. They are what I use now. They're how I do my basing. And I've got different types that I use for my different armies. So I use the Sterling Mud for my Dark Angels. And then I use the Agrellan Earth, which is like the broken earth, for my Death Watch. And I use the Astrogranite with snow, Valhallan snow on it for my, what are they called? Genestealer Cult. And then I think I've got some other ones that I've used combinations of. So I've done Sterling Mud in the snow for, I think that's for the one squad of Fallen that I've painted, and things like that. Like and I think I've just got basic Astrogranite for my assassins, things like that. Like, you just work it out, and I like to do it for the different armies because I think it's kind of interesting. It's a way for me to kind of see a difference in them. But it's super easy. Honestly, you just take it out of the pot, and this is one that you definitely don't thin. This is made to be taken out of the pot. And you put it on, and if you have like a reasonably thick layer of it on the base, it gives it dimension, it gives it texture, it gives it context, and it's really nice. You can go further, and you can do, once it dries, especially with the Sterling Mud, once it dries, you can do a dry brush. You can put a wash in there to give it some dimension. Honestly, they look good straight out of the pot as they are without even having to worry about some of those. And when I do that, what I do is I like to put it on top, and then I like to paint, wipe off excess from the edges, and then paint the edges of the base black so that it's only on top. That's just my personal way of doing it. You can paint it so it's all the way around it, or you can put, like if you're doing sterling mud, you can do a base paint of brown and then put the sterling mud on top and wipe it off from the sides and then repaint the brown. Same thing with astrogranite, paint it gray. You know, you can do whatever you want at that point, but I would using those technical paints, those texture paints, really ups the ante and makes the models look fantastic. I really like them. There's a billion other techniques that you can use to increase the look of your models as you decide that you want to commit further to painting them and making them look even better. There's techniques out there from painters that are far more qualified than I am to tell you how to do it. Just look it on YouTube, look on the interweb, Facebook, anywhere. But yeah, that's the basic for having painted army. And that's the basics for upping it so that you reach that point. And that's what it is. When I see the people who are like, oh, I'm an awful painter, I look at the models and it's not bad. What it is they've stopped. They haven't completed the process of painting. And if you don't complete the process of painting it, it's not gonna look good. It's not gonna look great. Any paint on there is gonna look better than plastic, but you're probably not gonna be happy with having a painted army unless you take those other steps. So that's what I would do, and that's what you need to do to just kind of up your ante when it comes to painting. So you've got a painted army, and I'm always a big fan of painted armies. They always look better. They always feel better. And you can use, if you're playing with your friends and you're just doing whatever, yeah, use your plastic, bare plastic models. If you just bought a new model and you've built it and you want to play it, yeah, absolutely do that. But if you're going to commit to playing games, you're going to commit to going to the game store, you're going to commit to just meeting your friends every weekend to bash your armies against each other. So at some point, you're going to want it to look good. You're going to want to have some investment into this. I mean, you've invested a lot of money into the models. You may as well invest a little bit of time and effort, and suddenly they're going to be way better, and they're going to be more. They're going to mean more to you. So, just taking the time to have a painted army is well worth it. And if you just follow those extra steps that I've talked about, going beyond just putting paint onto plastic, you're going to be happier with your result, and you're going to feel less dejected, because that's always what I hear. New painters are like, oh, it doesn't look good, there's no point in me painting, I can't do this. It's because you stopped. It's because you didn't go through the next steps. You didn't wash it. You didn't try to give a highlight. You didn't look to put in some details. You didn't clean up areas where you overpainted with the base coat. Any of those things are going to help you up your ante, so to make your models look better. And at that point, you're going to be happy with them. You know what I mean? Just take the time, take the effort, and just go through the steps to completion. And then if you're still not happy with it, you're still not happy with it. Then there's no pleasing you. No, at that point, whatever. If it's not for you, it's not for you. Painting isn't for everyone. I understand that. You can hire someone to paint if you want, or just play with bare plastic if you want. They're your models, they're your toys, do whatever the hell you want with them. You know what I mean? And don't let anyone else tell you otherwise. I know certain tournaments require painting, so at that point, what I talked about is the really quick, just prime, base coat, wash, and you're gonna look good. 3-color minimum they talk about, and it's gonna look good. It's gonna look fine on the table, and no one's gonna be disgruntled playing against you across from you on the table at a tournament when they've spent a lot of time putting into their armies. Because some people put more time into painting their armies than they do in playing, and that's fine. That's part of the hobby. And at that point, they're probably gonna wanna play against another painted army, because it's a little frustrating when you've put in a lot of time to make your army look great and someone across from you just says bare plastic. So put in the effort, put in the time, and it's going to come out, and it's going to make it worth it to you. And it doesn't take a lot of work. Like I said, it doesn't take a lot of effort, it doesn't take a lot of skill. The techniques I talked about can be done by literally anyone. Literally anyone. If you can just put paint onto plastic, you can do all the techniques I spoke of. The highlighting is a little bit of an up in the ante a bit, but other than that, everything that I talked about is totally doable. And then once you get that down, you can start to expand. So you can do non-metal metallics, you can do zenith shading, you can do any of the different methods that you will find people online that are far better qualified than I to tell you about. So so let me know what you think. Tell me what your basic painting is. Tell me what was the turning point for you when you started painting models, when you suddenly became happy with what you were getting. And tell me if you disagree with me. Tell me if you think that it's heresy not to highlight, or tell me if you think it's heresy to try to physically thin your paints as opposed to mechanically thinning the paints as opposed to physically thinning the paints. Let me know. And let me know your process. What do you do to paint your armies? Because, you know, a lot of these guys who do the stuff with the Golden Demons, they're painting one model, and they're spending months painting one model. But that's one model. That's not an army. That's not going to get on there. And if you're wanting to paint an entire army to get it onto the table, unless you're ready to dedicate years to painting that one army, and by that time the additions changed and the rules have changed, you're not going to be able to do that same process for every single guy in your army. And even the guys who do, like, you know, the commission painting, they're really good at what they do, but they also don't spend months on a single model. You know, the idea is that you spend enough time to make it look good, but still leave you the ability to play. So let me know what your process is. Let me know what you do. Let me know what your shortcomings are. I'd love to hear about it. Maybe we can, you know, the conversation can continue down there so that people can help each other and figure out how to get past some shortfalls that they're having. So I hope you guys all enjoyed it. Welcome to the first Deep Thoughts filmed here in Savannah, Georgia, and many more to come. So I hope you guys all enjoyed it. I have been Phil, the Glacial Geek, as always. And until next time, have fun.